This podcast is brought to you by True Resources, connecting talented people with the best mining employers in the Australian market. For more information, head to trueresources.com.au. So hello, I'm Ben Kostrich and welcome to the Market Bull podcast. I've got a pretty special episode today. I'm doing a bit of a panel discussion on the world of hydrogen. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the news globally, and I've got two gentlemen in the room today. I've got Stephen Hall, the CEO of Hexagon, listed on the ASX HXG, and also Nick O'Loughlin, the Managing Director of Sparc Technologies, which is also listed on the ASX. And I've actually lost the code here, but what is it listed as?
SPN.
SPN.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So those will both be in the show notes and the website for those that want to learn more. But firstly, welcome, gentlemen, to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
We'll start with you then, Nick, initially. Just introduce a little bit about yourself. You've come from an investment banking background and now find yourself in the managing director role, been there for a few years, but talk to us about a little bit your history and how you've found yourself in this world now.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So my background is in the resources industry, albeit on the investment banking side. So probably like a number in the hydrogen space. I've come out of that world, looking at resources and being Australian, there's a number of us in that same position, I guess. So I was covering, resources companies for global investment banks, worked in Australia and the UK, more recently with Rothschild in their mining and metals team over in London. And towards the end of my time in banking, for the resources space, started seeing that transition in action in terms of, looking to cleaner energy sources for the mining industry. Came back to Oz at the start of COVID and started working in that space directly with some consulting work with Rio Tinto and through some connections, based in Adelaide. Started hearing wind of what Sparc Technologies were doing with the University of Adelaide at that point in time, looking at a pretty novel way of producing green hydrogen. And that was really my entry into the hydrogen space. And that was back at the start of 2022. So I joined the company initially in a part-time capacity, looking after what is now the Sparc Hydrogen JV on behalf of Sparc Technologies. And as of January this year, stepped up to the managing director role, which I saw was a great opportunity because of the potential I was seeing on what we were doing in that JV, along with some of the other work the company was doing in graphene. So that's the 2-minute history, I guess.
No, fair. And then Stephen, you've got a slightly different one as expected because you've come from the oil and gas industry and you've worked for Woodside. But without telling your story for you, talk to us a little bit about your history and how you've gotten down this hydrogen path as well.
Sure. So, over 30 years experience in oil and gas and energy. Came out of the UK originally, trained as a geologist and geophysicist. And I probably worked in the North Sea for about 5 years before coming out to Australia. I spent over 25 years at Woodside, basically working across the value chain in all aspects of the company. So exploration, development, production, marketing, and then sort of leading corporate strategy and business planning as some of my other roles. After leaving Woodside, I was looking for something to do that was a little bit more focused on the energy transition rather than mainstream oil and gas. And I'd set up a consultancy and was having quite a bit of fun. And I ended up getting tapped on the shoulder by one of the directors of Hexagon, who, and this was about 2 years ago, who asked if I felt I could help them out. And so I had a bit of a look at what they were doing. And their problem was they had what they thought was a good concept, but they were frustrated that they weren't really getting anywhere. And so, cut a long story short, we decided to work together. And then a year later, they asked me to be CEO. And so
the rest is history now.
Here I am.
Yeah, gotcha. And this is a slightly the project that you've got at Hexagon. That's up in the west of Western Australia, up towards the port. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the company, the Flagship project is, and what you're looking to achieve there? And I guess that's saying what your role is about getting it up and running.
Yeah, sure. So look. So I'm the CEO of Hexagon. What Hexagon is looking to do is establish, we're a project developer and our focus is on the energy transition. And what that means in practice is developing a clean ammonia project, which we call WAH2. It's going to be located in the Maitland Strategic Industrial Area, which is just up near Karratha and close to the port of Dampier. And we're probably a little bit different from Nick in terms of the way that we're looking to make hydrogen and then turn it into ammonia. We're looking to use existing technology because it gives us cost and schedule advantages over the alternatives. And it also enables us, actually, I'll leave that there.
No, that's fair. And so then again, that's using a traditional side of, I guess, traditional technology. And on the flip, Nick, you're sort of approaching it from a slightly different point. And we'll take a step back in a moment of talking about hydrogen and especially green hydrogen. But firstly, just discuss, you mentioned the JV as well and some of the research and development you're doing within it. Can you talk a little bit about how your aspect or approach to hydrogen is slightly different?
Yeah, sure, Ben. So look, we're working on a process called photocatalysis as a way to produce green hydrogen. So everyone would have heard about the much touted, green hydrogen in Australia and globally, and 99.9% of those projects are based on electrolysis, which is using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, put simply.
Yeah.
My interest in the project when one of our directors came to us with what the University of Adelaide were doing originally in this space was that it was using a completely different method, which, as I said, is based on a process called photocatalysis. So it does not require electricity to split water, which is the key point. So, Fortescue are one of our partners in the project, and there's been a lot of news around that recently around their activities in hydrogen. And what we're seeing across that space is that power costs are really crimping efforts to progress green hydrogen using that traditional method, which is electrolysis. So we take a slightly different approach. I think it's got a lot of potential. And as I said, that was my interest around doing something different and seeing where that could take us, being a fairly unique player in that photocatalysis space.
So you're both within the hydrogen realm, and a lot of people, as we said, have heard about the Fortescue and some of the problems with the green hydrogen. I mean, can you both just talk a little bit about how that, I guess, is a part of what's happening in hydrogen, but a lot of people are now sort of realising the other potentials that are happening across the board? I don't know.
It's probably worth just stepping back a little bit of sort of why hydrogen or something. I mean, so hydrogen is fundamentally a source of energy, and it's an important source of energy for the energy transition if it can be produced without emissions or with very low emissions, because that is
the crux of it.
That's fundamentally the crux of it. And when people talk about hydrogen, they're actually talking about hydrogen and derivatives. So, for instance, if you want to transport hydrogen any distance, it's quite hard to do. You have to either cool it down a heck of a lot to a liquid,
change its constitution,
or compress it, in which case it doesn't,
cooperate.
It's just not very energy dense. So it's not efficient to transport hydrogen any distance as hydrogen. So if you want to transport it, you turn it into something else. And one of those things, in fact, the leading thing is ammonia, which is NH3. So there's no carbon in it. It's just hydrogen attached to a nitrogen atom. That supply chain becomes particularly useful or particularly efficient if what the customer actually wants is ammonia, not hydrogen. If they have to turn the ammonia back into hydrogen, there's a bit of wasted energy. Whereas if they actually want ammonia, which is the markets we're targeting, it becomes a very efficient supply chain. So when people talk about hydrogen, they're actually talking about ammonia as well when they're thinking of transporting it. The other thing I'd just like to touch on is, historically people have talked about different colours of hydrogen. Grey was the old-fashioned, which had a lot of emissions. There's green, there's blue,
I heard
there's
about
gold,
natural as
whatever.
well or something.
Well, and that debate has really has really sort of moved on from our experience. So we're looking at overseas markets to displace coal in coal-fired power station in places like Japan and South Korea. And we're looking at displacing marine diesel and fuel oil in shipping. But for each of those market sectors, people used to talk about green or blue or whatever, but what they now talk about is clean, and what they really want to know is, they're technology agnostic. They just basically want to know two things. What is the emissions profile of what you're selling me? And prove it. And what are you going to charge me for that product? And those are the two fundamental issues. So it's less about this color, that color, the other color. It's more about what's the intensity of your emissions and what are you charging for the product, in our experience, at least, Nick.
So I completely sort of agree with that. And just to build on that point around hydrogen and its derivatives, something I like to make point of with certainly a generalist audience is that green hydrogen or blue hydrogen or whatever has been, there's a bit of scepticism in the Australian market around it, and I get why. What is important to realise is that it's a 95 million tonne per annum industry as we stand here today, and that industry produces about 2.5% of global emissions. So as a huge source of carbon dioxide, the production of hydrogen and derivatives is a major challenge, a major hard-to-abate sector. And the challenge is producing it, cost effectively and with much lower emissions, as Stephen has said. So, they're challenges I think we're both trying to tackle from a different angle.
Okay. So,
and I think what's exciting is there's a real opportunity for Australia to become a leader in Asia in terms of low emissions or clean energy, which is, of course, one of the government's objectives is to position Australia as that. And maybe to kind of illustrate that a bit, and I'll use Japan as an example. Japan gets about 30% of its power at the moment from coal-fired power stations. Japan has made commitments to significantly reduce their emissions under COP, and the two are not compatible. They recognise that, so they have said that part of the solution is to start co-firing ammonia in coal-fired power stations, starting with 20% ammonia, 80% coal, and then increasing the percentage of ammonia over time. That has a significant impact in reducing the emissions in Japan. And so the Japanese government, recognising that, have set targets for clean ammonia import, and they have put in place a range of financial incentives to encourage sort of Japanese companies and international companies to collaborate and secure the supply chain for that. And for those listeners that are familiar with LNG or liquefied natural gas, this is exactly what Japan did 30 or 40 years ago, and it was Australia that has become the leading LNG supplier to Japan over the years. So there's a bit of back to the future in it. But the others, if we can get this to work, we're helping our Asian trading partners to decarbonise, and we're helping Australia to become this exporter of clean energy. But also, shipping is a huge contributor to emissions. Frankly, there are a number of different ways, they need to change the fuel of shipping, and there's a number of different technologies, but clean ammonia is one of them, and most projections have clean ammonia being about 40% of marine fuel in a couple of decades. The relevance for Australia is that the largest single tonnage trade route in the world is taking Australian iron ore from Northern Australia up to Asia. And so we've got an opportunity, if we can start replacing diesel with ammonia in those iron ore carriers, we're effectively helping to decarbonise and, if you like, future-proof Australia's exports.
Interesting. So, the devil's advocate would be like Asia is a giant market potentially. why isn't Australia potentially adopting it as an energy use, or is it part of our energy mix? I mean, what's the sort of realistic associations with where this is going? And I think, we all know that from a global point of view, Australia isn't the biggest market, and what we're good at is shipping stuff elsewhere. But I mean, what's really unfolding in the Australian perspective for the use of hydrogen?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to start here. And I think it goes back to a point, a few years ago when hydrogen was the much touted saviour for the energy transition of, storing energy and transporting clean energy and all of this type of thing. I think what people have come to realise is that hydrogen can play a role in certain sectors, and certain sectors make a lot more sense than others to use clean, green, hydrogen as a fuel source or a feedstock. So, the hard to abate sectors like steel making is a big one, cement manufacturing. These areas are the areas where I think hydrogen will play a key role. Areas like, cars, for passenger cars, EVs have kind of won the day.
Yeah.
So that's contributed to some of the skepticism that it was this sort of saviour for the energy transition.
It was labelled as the solution to every sort of energy solution instead of sort of specific use cases of it.
That's
in a way.
Right. It's going to go into specific use cases first, and those are the industries where the marginal sort of abatement curve is really in favour of using hydrogen as the fuel or the feedstock.
Okay. It does, part of the reason I think that, it was kind of seen as the panacea, and now there's a bit of a
realisation,
kind of reality check. It's because a lot of the initial debate was kind of without price in the mix. I mean, just to speak,
grounding factor,
to speak bluntly, clean hydrogen and ammonia costs more than old school hydrogen and ammonia to produce. And I think what's interesting, and this is why, we're using the technology we are, because it gives us an ability to supply at a lower price, is that people are prepared to spend a little bit more, but how much more is a question.
Yeah.
Now, for us, the markets that make sense are the export market for power generation, because there's some subsidies that really help make that work. And for displacing, and in terms of a domestic industry, it's really about displacing this fuel for the iron ore carriers. That is domestic, though, because at the moment, all those iron ore carriers get their fuel at the other end of the trade route. So effectively, if we can make this happen, we're onshoring that business that gets done overseas. At the other end of the spectrum, you could use clean hydrogen to make clean fertilizer, but it's very hard for a farmer to justify the increased cost of that fertilizer. I think it's hard in Australia, but it's also hard if you think about farmers across Africa or Asia. I mean, that's a personal view. I don't.
Yeah, no, like I wouldn't disagree. And I think in some ways, there's these different technologies and approaches to producing hydrogen, and they have different, use cases. As Stephen sort of, elaborate a little bit on the power markets in Asia. Part of what we're looking to do with our photocatalysis technology is to make a really modular, scalable system so that it doesn't. Obviously, solar resource is important, I should say. So we're using solar energy and converting that energy directly into stored energy in the form of hydrogen. But we're really conscious of developing a scalable system that doesn't need to be at the gigawatt scale to make sense, for export markets per se. So having systems which can be put in remote or off-grid environments is something that this technology potentially lends itself to. Because if I just look at green hydrogen via electrolysis as the comparator, that does require you to be on a grid, traditionally, and it does require the high voltage electricity infrastructure and typically larger scale projects. So we're focusing this technology as potentially being able to do that, large scale, but also at the smaller scale where, you might have a mine site which has a use case for hydrogen, but it doesn't have that electricity infrastructure. This technology that we're developing can be really well suited. So in some cases, different strokes for different folks on the technology choice there as well.
A bit of innovation, really.
It's a different approach, and and it lends itself to different potential use cases in that fashion as well.
And you were saying at the outset, I might go down further with that. It was with the University of Adelaide. That's where a lot of this is being developed. And I know that you said it was part of the JV. And I think that's notable as well, because if we tie it back, a lot of the news has been dictated by what Fortescue has been doing, but then simultaneously they haven't completely left that sector. It's just that the mainstream, I hate using that, but the mainstream would lead everyone to believe that hydrogen has been done and that the funding and all of this has been stopped, but simultaneously they've been deploying it. And I allude to it at the time with you, Stephen, that Woodside just made a massive purchase in the US, which was pretty groundbreaking from an Australian point of view in that ammonium scene. So there's stuff that's happening, but it's not really at the forefront. So I'd like to get, firstly, your take on what's developing with, I guess, the pivots in direction is you guys are finding it with the JV.
Yeah, look, and I'll focus on the electrolysis players to start with, and that was driving a lot of the hype cycle a few years ago in particular. So, look, what people have found out, I think, including Fortescue, is that the challenges to scaling these electrolysis projects are not insignificant beyond just the key input being power price, which drives the cost of hydrogen. So power prices, as your listeners would be aware, have not gone down. If anything, they've gone up over the past few years. And power prices need to be about a third of what they are now to actually be producing hydrogen competitively via electrolysis. So, that's a significant, a significant step change.
Yeah.
And yes, there are, government subsidies looking, at Australia and elsewhere to be available to help, I guess, catalyse the industry, pardon the pun, and get it off the ground using electrolysis. But my view, and I'm sure listeners might share this view, is that power prices are not going from where they are today to those levels of $20, $30 a megawatt hour anytime soon. So that's why we've seen, Fortescue cut back a bit on their project-related spend in the electrolysis space. And if anything, increases the focus, in my view, on their R&D work, of which they do a significant amount in green hydrogen and actually across the hydrogen value chain and across the energy value chain as well. So, yes, there was a bit of blowback around the time of the announcements on, us and others in the green hydrogen space, and that has been justified in terms of the electrolysis players. But when you're doing something different, like we're trying to approach it differently, I think ultimately it'll be positive, because people will be looking at new tech as a way to unlock the same outcome. And the outcome is that hydrogen will be required for these various sectors. It's just about how you get there in terms of cost the fastest.
And then that, it's a bit of a quick segue across, but when I was saying that the Woodside purchase, again, I was only alluded to it recently. It didn't really even cross my sort of news desk, so to speak. But when you're looking at the funding that suddenly went into that project in the Gulf, I mean, I think it was 2.3 billion Australian. It's not a small amount to be deployed, and I think, groundbreaking. But yeah, what is your thoughts on seeing that happen while simultaneously the holistic brush has been pretty much cast?
I guess it, from our perspective, it kind of it reinforces that our strategy was a sound strategy. So when you look at the market that we're trying to supply, the market door is completely open. Customers are just waiting for this clean product at a sensible price. The reason we've elected to go with reforming gas, carbon sequestration, and using existing technology is that the technology is available now. There are clear, it's significantly cheaper than electrolysis. So there are cost and schedule benefits. And when you look at the market, there are real advantages to being an early mover. And so that's what we're doing. If we then sort of pick up the Fortescue and Woodside things, I mean, my interpretation of the Fortescue pullback or whatever we're calling it is, I mean, it was just the fundamentals hit home that this is going to be a really expensive way to do things, and it's really hard to find people that it would make any sense or had the ability to pay that. And why would they when there are cheaper alternatives and available earlier? And I guess from the Woodside perspective is, I mean, that's effectively what we're trying to do here. They're investing in a project that takes gas, reforms it using existing technology, but basically very similar technology to we're looking. Because of the configuration of the technology, you can capture virtually all of the CO2, which you sequester, and you then have a low emissions product. Now, there's some interesting comparisons between the US and Australia that I can elaborate on as required. So we see Woodside's decision as a sort of a validation, if you like, of what we're trying to do.
Okay. So, I mean, I might pull on that thread there. So where do you see the similarities between the Australian and US market, or more so just what's unfolding with the use of it?
If you look at what Woodside has, and I'm only going on publicly available information, that they see the growing demand for clean ammonia. They see the use in displacing coal in power gen in Asia. They see the use in shipping in particular. So it's a very similar story. And they see that the most cost-effective way to produce this ammonia is by reforming gas, capturing the CO2, sequestering it, putting it on a ship, and taking it to market. Now, when you look at how Australia and the US compare, they're a different type of environment. Australia has a significant advantage in terms of shipping. We're a lot closer to Asia, and that actually has quite a significant impact on the cost of the delivered product. At the moment, gas is cheaper in the US, but it's also volatile. So sometimes it's cheaper, sometimes it isn't, and it depends where you want to.
Yeah, geopolitical things, or potentially, yeah.
And also in the States, there have been some subsidies around the Inflation Reduction Act. The interesting thing there is that money is proving harder for people to actually access under the current administration. And there's a growing school of thought that if there were to be a change of administration in the States, then the Inflation Reduction Act money might disappear altogether.
Interesting.
In Australia, you've got the Australian government looking at what it can do to facilitate, and then there's a number of sensible initiatives being progressed there.
Okay.
What we're finding when we talk to customers in Japan, for instance, is that they are looking for a portfolio of supply, and the obvious places to get ammonia are the Middle East, because there's pretty cheap gas there, but geopolitically you don't want to be overexposed.
Well, I think everyone knows you've got to diversify your access to resources.
Well, that's right.
Now.
And then in the US, there's some attraction to the US, but the feedback we're getting is they firmly see Australia as part of that supply portfolio, just like they did with LNG.
Okay. So then you both have been, I guess, prospectively within the resource in 2 years, I guess for both of you in specific the hydrogen. What have you really seen change and evolve within that sector over this period of time? And now looking forward to the future, where do you really see it going with some of these new innovations, but also just the changing in perspective? Because I think really the education from the forefront, we need to move away from what everyone had, that paintbrush approach to hydrogen, and now refocusing. And I think that'd probably be what both of you are trying quite intently to do, is to rechange the sort of perspective on it. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? What's been happening?
Yeah, look, happy to start. I'm sure Stephen will have some perspectives as well. But yeah, as we discussed before, the market is definitely becoming more discerning around what hydrogen can do and the different ways you can produce it, and what is driving these projects in terms of the electrolysis projects that have been put through various stages of development to this point in time. And there's been a realisation around that. So for us, it hasn't been surprising, as the market ultimately turns and reality starts kicking in, that people start saying, okay, well, maybe that doesn't work as a use case, or that doesn't work as a production method with these input prices. And that's where, I think what the market has realised on the electrolysis side of things. So, so just to compare with Stephen and what Hexagon are doing, using existing tech versus new tech. Building value in a project versus building value in a technology. So Sparc Hydrogen is about building value in a technology. We're ultimately a technology company. We feel like we've got great partners with Fortescue and the University of Adelaide to do that within that vehicle. And ultimately, whether it's us that build projects on the back of the photocatalytic, water splitting reactors we're developing, or if it's someone else, in some ways, that's down the road, and we're potentially agnostic just based on what is best for the company at the time. But there's a real distinction to make there around what each company is trying to achieve, and it goes to what each company's sort of focus is and where the money's going. Ours is going into sort of tech development, and without putting words in Stephen's mouth, I assume it's in more project development on that side of things. So, yeah, that would be my perspective.
So where does it go?
Well, just to sort of echo a couple of Nick's points, I think, from a few years ago, there was this kind of evangelical belief that there'd be a sort of silver bullet that would solve everybody's problems. And there was a lot of talk about it, but I think as time has passed, there's a growing reality that this is a bit more complicated and nuanced. I think what's good is that, and there is no single silver bullet. It's going to have to be a portfolio or a number of different things. So, I think it's fantastic that Sparc are developing the technology they are. And picking on your point, Nick, you're right. We're a project developer, not a technology developer. We're technology agnostic, but when we did our analysis, it was very clear to us the technology we should be using for our initial project. We have phase 2 of our project, which is basically going to double the size of it. And that the technology we use for that might well be different from the technology we use for phase 1, because, another 3 years is a long time in technology.
Yeah.
And so I think the whole kind of energy transition ecosystem is it's healthier with more people in it, more people, trying to make a difference.
Yeah, well, the reality is everyone's on their different roads, but it's all towards the same objective. And I think that's where we've seen it with the energy transition. Everyone's just assumed that it's just going to be one, and now we're sort of hearing that it's going to be a mix, because you cannot solely, and we never have relied on purely one form of energy, and the applications and the storage and everything within it has to be adjusted depending on its use case. And we're seeing that with the electric vehicle market. We're seeing it now with the battery storage side of things. We're seeing it now with just everything, and that's the excitement. And if I bring it to, as you said, Australia's opportunity, we're pretty pioneering in technology front for better and, well, it really is better. We just don't really get as much recognition for it, surprisingly. But then on the export front, there's a lot of opportunity, and that's really where I'd be curious to find out where you're seeing that develop, and from support from local communities or even federal government. Where is that direction going from Australia's point of view, and do you think there could be more, or I think I'm sort of answering the question myself if I say more, but yeah, where do you see that? And Stephen, you talked about the US with change in politics. It's awful to bring politics into podcasts, but the reality is changes in leadership can completely sway the course. Do you feel that with these directions set, at least in Australia, if it does change, there's still a pretty foundation set that this energy mix that we're going towards is going to be a spread, and that all these resources and forms of energy are going to be incorporated? It's a bit of a big one, so apologies.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and again, Stephen will probably elaborate on what I say, but I'd completely echo the comments earlier that it is a portfolio approach, and there's not going to be a one size fits all, particularly when it comes to hydrogen and the different ways to produce it. Just looking at the sort of government role in the industry, I think it's a really important topic, because there are huge risks, whether you're looking at existing tech and developing projects, or you're looking at pushing forward new tech. There are huge risks that still exist in this space, because it is really redoing the energy system in many ways, and there's a lot of investment that needs to occur. And the government has a role, I think, to catalyse that. I think not picking winners is a very important role of the government, and spreading that funding across different areas. So not picking one technology or one use case, or export markets versus domestic. I think there's got to be a recognition that it needs to be spread in terms of the way the government approaches it. And I'm hopeful. Looking at electrolysis again as our comparator, that some of those projects do get up and running, and I'm sure they will attract subsidies early in the day through Hydrogen Head Start, probably being the most visible one in Australia. But that helps to play a role in developing infrastructure, expertise, knowledge, all of the things that flow through to other projects and other technologies in the hydrogen space. So I don't necessarily focus on those type of large-scale subsidies, because we're looking at the more R&D type funding, of which there's a number of buckets within Australia. The US does it very well. Australia does it pretty well. But I'll leave it there, and I'll let Stephen comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government has a really important role to play in sort of facilitating and encouraging, and like governments are doing overseas, whether it's Korea, Japan, the US, and there's a lot of attention on how do we make this happen. I mean, if I think about the Australian government, there are some sources of funding, the NAIF and so forth. Hydrogen Head Start, in my view, could be a little bit different. At the moment, it's focused only on electrolysis, which again is picking a winner. And personally, I favour the don't pick a winner, as Nick was saying. There's at the last budget, the government announced a hydrogen production tax incentive, which has the potential to be a significant enabler. Now, there's been a consultation paper on that, and there's a debate ongoing around what's the appropriate construct for that. But I think getting the construct for something like that right is a huge enabler to take Australia forward. And so I'm kind of really interested in participating in that debate and seeing what we can do to really position Australia well.
So there's a fair bit happening, and I mean, that might be a good segue to quickly just talk about yourselves and what the companies are looking to achieve in the next period of time, because today, as I said, both listed, both doing stuff within hydrogen but slightly different objectives. So Nick, if we start with you, I mean, can you just encapsulate a little bit about what really investors can expect coming from Sparc Technologies over the next 6 to 12 months? And I mean, it goes without saying, but there's a website and there's ASX, but talk about what people can expect coming from the company.
Yeah, sure, Ben. So look, we've been at it with Fortescue and the university in this joint venture for about 2.5 years, and we've achieved a lot over that period of time. The nut we're looking to crack is not insignificant. If it was, people would have done this earlier. But the carrot at the end of it is really quite significant, because we are on a completely different technology path than electrolysis or other forms of hydrogen production. And the potential for photocatalysis is huge, not only in terms of cost, but also in terms of flexibility and scalability, being not constrained to grid infrastructure or where hydrocarbon resources are or the like. So we've made really good progress. As I said, most recently we completed prototyping of our photocatalytic water splitting reactor at the CSIRO Energy Centre in Newcastle. And that prototyping went really well. We did 2 rounds of that, and we were supported with some funding from the CSIRO along with the Australian government through a AEA funding round, which was great. And what that prototyping work has done is, number one, show that we can do it in the field. It was the first step out of the lab for this particular technology. So we had our prototype up in front of a solar field. We were concentrating sunlight onto it, and we were producing hydrogen. So that was great, but not unexpected. What it also did was help de-risk the design of our reactor, which will go into a pilot scale plant. And that is using a different type of mirror field. And that pilot plant will be built up at Roseworthy, which is a University of Adelaide campus about 50 k's north of Adelaide. And that pilot plant will be we're calling a first of its kind facility, demonstrating photocatalysis at some scale, albeit small scale. So that will be a really important step for the technology. We're in the feed of that at the moment, and we're looking to complete feed around November. And the build of the pilot is, 4 to 6 months thereafter. So by Q2 next year, we're looking to have that pilot commissioned and up and running. And I think that'll be a really important step for our investors and potential investors to actually understand the look and feel of the technology. One of the things we're really keen to highlight is that once we demonstrate it at pilot scale, going larger from there is largely bolting on the same
So
mirror
scalability
field.
is quite quick.
It is. It is really a scalable approach that we're looking to take. And one of the benefits of focusing on our water splitting reactor but using existing infrastructure from the concentrated solar industry is that we're not looking to scale both at the same time, which can potentially accelerate, lower costs in the initial phases and accelerate commercialisation once we've proven it at that small pilot scale. So that's what we're looking out for, and we're really focused on delivering that pilot and then looking forward to what's next, which would be a small commercial facility most likely.
Okay. So that's happening on your side of things. Then you're in a very different sort of kettle of fish on your end.
We're focused on delivering the project. So we're currently in pre-feed, rapidly approaching feed, so front-end engineering and design. To enter feed, we need to finish off the technical work we're doing, which is sort of all in hand, and secure the preliminary commercial agreements that we're currently in discussions on. Following feed, we expect to be taking a final investment decision on the project at the end of next year, so the end of 2025. It's a 3-year build and commission. So basically by the end of 28 is our target for startup and start of operations.
And if I may, does that tie in quite seamlessly with Japan, which I'm assuming is, as you've alluded to, it's one of the main markets?
Does. I mean, it ties in with our CCS providers, gas suppliers and the like. And yes, on the market, there's a real benefit being on stream before 2030, because that's, of course, when a lot of people have made promises in terms of reducing their emissions. And so we want to be comfortably before 2030.
Makes sense.
And so our target is end of 28.
Well, we've covered a lot, and I always find that, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. And I know both of the websites have got their respective information on it, and the projects and company specific. And realistically, that's why I do the individual one. So I might have to get you both back on to do one by one so we can go into it. But in closing, if there's really key takeaways that you'd urge investors, listeners, and more so people that have found this podcast and have learned something about hydrogen, what would you say those key takeaways from this conversation might be? And I'll see if you can get different ones. We might both agree on the same takeaways, but we'll see. So yeah, take it away.
Yeah, look, I'll focus on self-serving takeaways
No, very fair.
For Sparc and what Sparc Hydrogen are doing, and I'd encourage people who are interested in the hydrogen space and in the energy transition to look into what Sparc Hydrogen are doing as an alternative to the broader green hydrogen movement and industry, which is really focused on electrolysis. And there's been a lot of funding going into that space. Hydrogen Head Start is a good example where that's all focused towards electrolysis. And I understand why to a certain extent, because electrolysis is old world technology. Actually, it's been around for about 100 years. But I also think, smart money should be looking at alternatives to do the same thing. I think photocatalysis has a number of potential advantages, and what I'm confident on is that Sparc Hydrogen has a sort of industry-leading approach to developing scalable photocatalytic water splitting reactors. We're not seeing anyone else as advanced as we are in this space, and it positions us really well with a huge carrot on the end of it if we're able to scale our tech. We're confident, as Stephen is, that the market will be there, and it's about scaling our tech, de-risking it, and then I think the inbound interest will only sort of multiply from where we are today.
There we go. And Stephen?
Look, what Hexagon offers is a pragmatic, i.e. credible approach to the energy transition. And I guess if investors are looking for exposure to the energy transition, I'd encourage them to take a look at Hexagon, see what we have to offer. There's a lot of material on our website. There's a means of asking questions of management on the website, and take a look and see what you think.
Fair cop. Well, yeah, and it's an area that I haven't spoken about, and I think answering my own question, I'll have to have you both on individually to do a further deep dive and a discussion on each project and the technology. But yeah, thank you both so much for speaking on the panel. I don't know really how to quite call it, but on the podcast. So yeah, thank you very much. And as I said, I urge anyone to, if they have any questions, reach out. I'm sure both websites have got contact information or even phone numbers and all of that. So yeah, thank you both so much for speaking on the show today.
Thanks very much, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Thanks for listening to the Market Bull podcast. Please remember that the topics and stocks discussed in this podcast are not financial advice. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like, share, and follow. You can follow the Market Bull on all our socials and keep up to date with global market insights.